Let's tell you about what President is expected to do today, and that's to table South Africa's economic recovery plan. That's later in Parliament. It's widely expected that the plan will deal with job losses caused by the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdown restrictions. Statistics South Africa's latest figures show that about 2.2 million people lost their jobs in the second quarter of the year, when only essential services workers were allowed to leave their homes for work purposes. I'm joined now by our business editor, Xolani Mbanjwa, who is in Parliament this morning, and there he is. We're also going to be joined in this conversation by Saftu General Secretary, that's Zwelinzima Vavi, and Cosatu Spokesperson Sizwe Pamla, and they're going to tell us about their expectations of what the President has to say. Let's start with you, Xolani Mbanjwa, and the expectations are clear. 2.2 million people are now sitting at home having lost their jobs thanks to the coronavirus. The President has a tough task of assuring the nation that those jobs will be saved or perhaps recovered.
Good morning, Oli. Well, it's quite an important day, and you are right. The second quarter figures were 2.2 million jobs that were lost. But as we know by now, there are more than 3 million people since the second quarter who have actually lost their jobs. And this is according to the Presidential Advisory Council, which actually sent that document to the President as investigations and surveys have been taken about how many people have lost their jobs since the start of this pandemic. And we heard only earlier this week, Thulas Nxesi, the Minister of Employment and Labour, telling the Select Committee on Employment and Labour this week that he is expecting another bloodbath, a slew of retrenchments in the next coming months, and therefore the Unemployment Insurance Fund may actually be approached by the department, may actually approach the government rather, to actually get more funding. And they are left with reserves of 50 billion rands, and they are expecting that more people will come and approach the UIF for claims. So we are expecting more and more people to actually be announced to have lost their jobs in the next couple of months. Today's announcement is actually an important one by President Cyril Ramaphosa, because it is going to chart a path for the whole country about how we are going to make sure that we absorb the people who have lost their jobs, and what we're going to do to actually make sure that there are jobs out there, the demand is high, and we can actually reskill some of these people. It's an important one, and it's more actually important, one might say, than all the other speeches that President Cyril Ramaphosa may have given in the past.
Very true. And how have the markets been reacting to the expected announcement by the President?
The markets say that, the stock markets say they have already priced in a disappointment from today, because they do not expect much to have changed, no drastic, measures. What would be on the surprise side and an upside only would be the President, in fact, announcing some harsh implementation measures, because we have come to know, only as you are aware, that in the past couple of years, in the past 20 years rather, all of the plans since the Reconstruction and Development Plan have not actually worked or been fully implemented. So the big word today is implementation. What is government going to do when it comes to implementation? We always write great and marvelous, plans and put them on the ground. We started with GIPSA. We started with the new growth path. We started with the new development plan. Those have come to actually naught. So what the President is expected to actually demonstrate today is the willingness to actually make sure that both the private sector and the public sector buy into this particular plan and there is real implementation. We also expect that to be told exactly how much it's going to cost, because as you'll remember, the business lobby actually said instead of the 500 billion rands stimulus package, the country needs over 3 trillion rands in stimulus package. And you'll remember a couple of months ago as well, there were 100 economists who actually said we should, as a country, reject Tito Mboweni's supplementary budget because it is not enough. So there is cause that we need to cost actually this reaction, how much we're going to spend and what we're going to spend on, which programs are labor absorptive. And if that doesn't happen, it's going to be really a disappointment. But it seems that the markets have already priced in a disappointment even before this economic and reconstruction plan has been announced by the president.
All right, Xolani Mbanjwa, I'm going to ask you to just stay where you are, and let's bring into the conversation Saftu General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi. Mr. Vavi, thank you very much for making the time to speak to us here. Interesting report on the business day today, and that is the report from the IMF, an institution that is known for encouraging fiscal constraint in as far as, government spending is concerned. This time around, they actually are encouraging governments to spend more because they're saying this will hopefully stave off an economic collapse. This is to all governments around the world. A surprise?
Well, maybe they are better realistic than the South African government that is more to the right of the IMF and World Bank on many issues. And it's encouraging to hear that noise, even though that's a little bit too late for a patient that have died already. With 2.2 million jobs lost, with the around 50% unemployment rate, with about 70-80% youth unemployment rate, with the 60+% of 60% of a population trapped in poverty and living below the poverty line. That type of a statement is rather too late. South African government have already lost a big opportunity, even in the context of COVID. You remember, Xoli, we have been saying that we have been in a crisis from colonial apartheid capitalist era. We have been going deeper into the crisis with the worsening poverty, unemployment, inequality in the first 26 years of democracy. Neoliberalism has not worked. Austerity have worsened the situation already. The COVID pandemic have rather put the last nails in the coffin of the working class and the poor in our society. For the IMF to come now, it's too late. The government had an opportunity with the 500 billion rands that it said was a stimulus package. At that point, we pointed out that this was not a stimulus package. A stimulus package is when you put new money and deploy that new money into ensuring that your firms do not collapse in the wake of the lockdown, in the wake of the regulations that restrict business. Government refused to do that. Instead, it took money from other programs in order to fund the so-called stimulus. Now we know that the only stimulus that may have worked is the 50 billion rands that went to the UIF, even though the hyenas stole even that money. The rest of the loan bank schemes to the bank have simply failed dismally. The 75% of the meager amounts that were put aside to help the small, medium, macro enterprises, 75% of that went to white firms. The black entrepreneurs found themselves, just like the working class, in facing the barrel of the lockdown regulations, and they have died. And that's very, very sad for our future. So what we expect today, unfortunately, is a government that simply refuses to recognize what is the source of the crisis we are facing at the economic level.
Yeah,
From
Mr.
Saftu.
Let me ask you to just pause there for a second. Let me bring into the conversation Sizwe Pamla, and he is with the Trade Union Federation, Cosatu. That's the biggest labor federation in the country. Mr. Pamla, thanks for your time. You have been listening to this conversation, but importantly, you are part of the so-called governing alliance. You also sit at NEDLEC. What should we expect to come out of the speech by the President later today?
Well, we would like to see really a plan on how to deal with the reliable electricity supply, because without a reliable electricity supply, there's very little that we will be able to achieve. I mean, the fact that half a decade later, in fact, we can go back to 2008 with the problems of Eskom. The fact that we continue to call Eskom an urgent issue, and yet we are not acting in a manner that proves that the issue of electricity is important, is a problem. So we need to get the basics right. It doesn't matter really how you come out with new money. We have said, at a minimum, just at a minimum, we need $1 trillion going forward. But if that money is going to be looted, like we have seen, if you don't come out with a solid, coherent plan on how do you really close the leakages that we have seen, because that's the problem. The issue of US test funds, that is the new money that was supposed to be injected in an economy that was desperate for the new money, but that money was stolen. You look at the money that was budgeted for PPE, that money was stolen. So you look at the price fixing that continues to take place. Even on infrastructure plan, you can go back to the infrastructure plan of 2009 to 2019, where we borrowed more than $2 trillion. Most of that money was really stolen. So the reality is that we have the fundamentals wrong. So there are some basics that we haven't really managed to fix.
Yeah.
And if we don't have a plan on how to fix them, we can actually do a lot. There is room for us to do a lot. But the problem is that when you have a private sector that steals at a massive scale, when you have a government that steals at a massive scale, it doesn't matter what you make available, because at the end of the day, the money isn't going to go where it's supposed to go and fix the problems that we want fixed.
Yeah. Mr. Pamla, you've touched on a myriad of issues, and while I appreciate that, there is also the reality that you are part and parcel of this problem in South Africa, and that's the reason I opened to you by saying you're part of the so-called governing alliance. Therefore, you have better insight on what the planning is. Let's go back to the very first issue you touched on, and that is that of electricity, reliable electricity supply. The President isn't likely to tell us anything that is much more interesting than what he told us, for example, during one of his Monday letters, that there is going to be 11,000 more megawatts of electricity that is added to the grid. The key question here, as my colleague in Parliament stated, is implementation is a major problem for this government. Can we expect that this reliable electricity supply is something that can finally be delivered on?
Well, look, we have played our role in coming out with ideas on how to sort out electricity problems. We have lobbied, we have engaged with people, and we, to a certain extent, have a consensus on how to deal with some of the problems that really make it difficult for us to turn around Eskom. But I think you're asking the wrong person. You can ask me what the President is going to say. This is a cabinet decision. So whatever the cabinet has resolved to do, then the cabinet will have to explain itself. So I can only explain our hopes, I can only explain our inputs, but when you come and say, you want me to make a commitment, I'm not sure where do I make that commitment, from what perspective will I say, I think this is what is going to happen, or I can assure you that this is what is going to happen.
All right, let's take you to Parliament now, and Mr. Pamla, just stay on the line for us. Xolani Mbanjwa, coming back to you, The Cosatu is very clear that reliable electricity supply is one of the key starting blocks if we are to genuinely revive this economy. Any expectations, particularly from the business community, about whether or not they are assured that government is going to resolve this issue?
Xoli, I think you mentioned it very well in your question to Sizwe Pamla there, that we shouldn't expect much more than what the President and the government has said, as far as what government said about the buying new electricity and getting new electricity on the grid from independent power producers. And I don't think that we are expecting anything more than that. You're absolutely right. But the magnitude of how important really Eskom is to the South African economy, even Moody's, even Fitch, even the World Bank, even the IMF have all singled out Eskom reliable electricity supply as the single biggest risk to all of South Africa's economy. With COVID-19 and the resurgence of the coronavirus pandemic and those numbers being, second, the number one threat and the Achilles heel to our growth is Eskom. And we heard from Andre de Ruyter, the CEO of Eskom, saying that he knows and he is aware of how deep the problems are and how important it is for Eskom to actually stabilize. But what was important in his address at the Joburg mining in Daba was his views when it comes to what would actually stabilize Eskom. The biggest issue at Eskom is its high debt levels. At 488 billion rands, Andre de Ruyter says he needs help to actually halve that debt to 200 billion rands and make sure that there is cold hard cash of 30 billion rands and an EBITDA margin of 35% before Eskom can even consider not to approach government anymore with bailouts and financial support. So where is that 200 billion rand or 280 billion rand going to come from to actually stabilize Eskom? It's actually not something that we can expect to be answered today, but it's not something that is an easy question to answer, seeing that these problems have been there at Eskom for a while. So the President, you're absolutely right, he is not expected today to actually chart a two-year plan as to how these things, how Eskom is going to be dealt with.
Xolani Mbanjwa, let me thank you for the time being. And Mr. Vavi, your final thoughts, and I want to touch on the issue of corruption, and perhaps let's focus it on Eskom. Today, a report on the front page of the Business Day talking about the SIU that has referred some employees, about 5,000 of them, from Eskom for a range of things, doing business with the entity. I guess that is obviously not allowed, to failure to declaring their financial interests. Corruption is a problem in this country. It's a massive cancer. Are you assured that it is being dealt with? I mean, I speak with Angelo Agrizzi, having spent his first night in police holding cells today. Surely there's some glimmer of hope.
There have been some interesting activities that have been about chasing the small lizards, in our view, Xoli. We have not touched the crocodiles yet. We have not touched the Steinhoffs of the world. We have not yet touched even a single of those guys who are moving up to 400 billion rands annually through illicit financial flows. We have not touched the guys who are stealing from the procurement budget yearly to the tune of 250 billion rands. We have not touched the tax dodgers. And if you listen to what Judge Dennis was saying, there's about 350 billion rands that we're losing as a result of what they call aggressive tax arrangements, which is actually tax dodging schemes. We must welcome that the lizards are being chased. and we see them, they are absolutely rattled. But please, let's deal with the real corruption. The center of corruption in our country is in the private sector. The capitalist system simply breeds more corruption by its nature as it promotes profit maximization at all costs. So we must address the problem fully. And I suspect the reason why government is not chasing these guys is because the next people that may wear overalls are the beneficiaries of the PEE who are sitting in these boards of these companies that are committing heinous crimes. Make an example. 40 financial institutions were caught red-handed manipulating the currency of South Africa. They are being challenged, they are being charged, and they are being made to pay hefty fines in the United States. But here at home, which is the main victim of their nefarious activities, not a single of them have been made to account. That's the difference. We are just not serious. We are not serious about fighting corruption in this country, because I suspect the crocodiles will include the people who are going to be making speeches today promising us something that they know they will not do anything about.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi. He is the General Secretary of Saftu. Final thoughts from you, Sizwe Pamla, as I wrap up. It's interesting comments from Mr. Vavi that at the moment, law enforcement, whilst they're doing good work, but you're chasing lizards and the crocodiles have yet to be touched. I want to ask you the question, having had one of your alliance partners last night sitting exactly where I am, complaining about the so-called Hollywood style of arrests by the hawks. Why should South Africans care about the manner in which your leadership is arrested? If they are corrupt, they must be arrested anyhow and embarrassed the best way we can so that they do not repeat the same. Why should South Africans care